Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the player. Thank you to Cristina, the CF and the organizer, to have me today as the conductor or the introducer or the master of ceremony. I don't know very well how to call it, but it's my role here to introduce our keynote speaker and our distinguished speakers of this closure plenary session. And we began with the mystery of closing things, because openings and closing has to be a celebration. I don't know why, but this is a mystery. We open with celebration, we have to close with celebration. So this is a keynote session, but it's also a celebration. You are very much welcome to the closure celebration with music and with dancing, and also with thinking with objects. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful. It's the second time I have come to Santiago. My name is Francisco Cruces. I come from UNED, the University at a Distance in Spain. It's one of the founding institutions of the conference. I am very happy to be here also in their names. They were very happy that I joined this adventure, this endeavor, but at home they were not so happy, because now are holidays, you know, in Spain. And past year when I was to come, I have a kid, 12 years old, and he told me, "Where did you go?" And I said, "To Santiago." "What?" "To prepare a conference." "A conference on what?" "On transformations." I tried to make it sexy, but it wasn't. He told me, "Transformation, what kinds of transformations?" As I said, every kind of transformation. We are going to be 3 days speaking on all kinds of transformations. Transformation in language, transformation in climate, transformation in geography, transformation in history, in culture, in everything. And he told me, "This is not serious." It's not serious at all. So I didn't try to convince him, and I'm gonna give this advice. Don't try to convince your people when you go back that we were doing something very serious here. But I have the feeling we have done something very serious. We have been very seriously working on all kinds of transformations, the epistemological transformations of knowledge and evidence regimes, the transformation of the gesture that make the traceability of past and present, and put past and present together. That's a very important transformation. Or the digital transformations and the narratives that evolve, saying America first, Spain second. So we have working seriously but also friendly about this transformation, and I am so happy to bring another kind of objects today, without which I think that our conference would be lacking something very important, which are objects and the play of objects in our lives. And so the roundtable after our keynotes is gonna be addressing this issue of objects. And I was trying to figure out with Barbara, that I am gonna introduce now, on Monday, how could I put together museums, which are so important to all of us, and objects in daily life. And she gave me the clue. She told me, "Well, but my museum is very special. It's a museum that is done," maybe I am doing the spoiler, so sorry, Barbara, if I spoil something, but she told me, "Well, my museum, which is the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Youths in Warsaw, is built on an area of the city that was completely destroyed by the Nazis. So you imagine a museum of nothing, a museum built without objects." So the key things that Barbara told me is, in this museum, the story came before, and we had to look for the object then. And so I understood that there is no objects without stories, and our session deals about this, the relationship that stories maintain always with objects and vice versa. So you are very much welcome. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, and after that, I will introduce the other three distinguished speakers and guests of this celebration. I don't want to introduce you there, so we will let it after. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. I think that she is very important for the people in CF. She, of course, I am not going to read the complete curricula of our 4 speakers. Sorry, forgive me for that. It's written in the book. I invite you to look at it and to believe all, because you know that things that are written are true. We know that. Barbara is the curator of this museum I was mentioning in Warsaw, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and she's also emerita professor from NYU, from New York University. And then the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you very, very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's my second CF meeting. The first was in 2004 in Marseille. And I am just really thrilled with the invitation, and I want to thank the organizers for having organized such a stimulating event. And I hope to be able to come again on some other occasion. Now, what I want to do today is not only to think about museums, but also to think with them. And I want to do that in a way that will reflect what we've been discussing for the last few days. And I'd like to suggest that there's not a person in the room, not a panel, and not a paper that does not have some immediate relevance to thinking about and with museums. Now, the definition of a museum that ICOM had put forward in 2007 is something like this. The museum is a non-profit, permanent institution in the service of society and its development open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. It's a very peaceful definition of museums. And actually, it's, I would say, pretty old-fashioned. 2007, I would say that the innovation here is the inclusion of intangible heritage. Now, in December 2018, which is only a couple of months ago, the ICOM Executive Board called for an alternative definition that would recognize the following: dissimilar conditions and practices of museums in diverse and rapidly changing societies, and that museums would be defined as supporting in the development and adopting of new scientific paradigms and addressing more adequately the complexities of the 21st century. And that is a very, I would say, bold call, and it's accompanied by a 9-page document which is online that lays out what's expected. Now, in 2017, in a volume entitled Museum Critique to the Critical, From Museum Critique to the Critical Museum, which was edited by Katarzyna Murawska-Mutesius and Piotr Piotrowski, what they argued is that the, if you will, museum critique is the hallmark of the new museology. And it could be said that ICOM has taken a long time in the definition of the museum to catch up with the new museology, which was emerging already in the 1980s. And by 1989, with the publication of the new museology, shortly thereafter, exhibiting cultures, museums, and communities, that's already a development of the last 30 years. And that 2007 definition does not reflect that. And so the call now for a new definition that would better reflect what museums have become is in a way 30 years later. And so so museum critique, I would say, was the hallmark of the new museology, and presumably it was to lead to what Katarzyna and Piotr called the critical museum. In other words, the critical museum would contribute to debates on the issues most fundamental to the contemporary world, that it would empower the viewer, and that it would expose conflicts and redress social inequalities. That is a very, very different notion of a museum. That is truly, if you will, the optimism of the potential for museums to be agents of transformation. And I would say that this is not a view, this is actually a very, in many ways, a very Western European, American, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian view of museums. It's certainly not the consensus, for example, in Poland today, where there is on the part of the historical policy and the right-wing government a view that museums would be much more like that 2007 definition, much more consensual, much more, if you will, peaceful and affirmative. So this is a major, major paradigm shift, at least in the way in which museums are being redefined, although I think on the ground, quite a number of museums have either transformed themselves or are being created from scratch in this critical museum mode. So that's the paradigm shift. Now, agency. I think of agency in relation to urgency and in relation to efficacy. And what I would like to do is to demonstrate these ideas through my experience as the person responsible for leading the development of the core exhibition, the permanent exhibition of Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. In October 2014, on I think October 28th, 2014, we had the grand opening. And Arnie Eisen, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, shortly after, he was there at the opening, shortly after, he made this comment. And this comment has several layers to it. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it. And rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of Polin Museum. So the first thing I would say is cautious observers is an understatement. And the second is that considering how cautious both Jewish audiences and Polish audiences were about what this museum would be, I think that his comment that the museum could be a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward was an astonishing and a very inspiring thing for him to say. So let me introduce you briefly to the museum. Of course, I invite you all to come. Warsaw's not that far away. Well, it's closer to Berlin than it is to Spain, but nonetheless. And this indeed is the place where the museum has been built. It has been built on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, excuse me, and which was home to the largest Jewish community in Europe. It was home to 300,000 Jews, a third of the population of Warsaw. And after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is actually in this period now, in April and May of 1943, they simply destroyed, they leveled the ghetto, they leveled the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, and they left an ocean of rubble. On the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1948, there was the unveiling of a monument to the ghetto heroes. And you can see the destroyed city of Warsaw in the background because about a year later, there was the Warsaw Uprising, and when the Germans suppressed that, they destroyed 85% of the historical core of the city of Warsaw. And so you can see that the rubble is they're just barely getting started on clearing the rubble. They're climbing up to unveil the monument. And until we opened the museum, the doors in 2013 and the grand opening in 2014, this was really the icon of what had been the largest Jewish community in Europe, what had been the largest ghetto created by the Germans in occupied Poland. It was a monument surrounded by communist-era apartment blocks. And so in 1993, inspired by the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there was the idea that if there was a Holocaust Museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw, that it should stand facing the monument to the ghetto heroes, that it should complete the memorial complex, that we would go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died, and we would come to the museum to honor them by remembering how they lived and how they had lived for 1,000 years in this territory, a story that had been lost more than once. It was